Process of Elimination, written by the Seven Saviors. Part 3. Chapter 9. The Beginning. I wasn't quite sure what was going on anymore. In that moment, down there at the bottom of the stairs in that dark and ancient dungeon, I felt like my life was about to change irreversibly. It might sound a bit melodramatic, but as a filly, this was too much to take in all at once. Confusion, fear, and dread were making my stomach turn and my head pound painfully. Questions shot through my young mind at an impossible pace. What was happening to me? What was I thinking? What was wrong with me? What was wrong with Blue Blood? How did Crimson Storm find me all the way down here? What happened to Blue Blood's friends? What was Crimson Storm going to do to the cult? As I looked into the mare's cold golden yellow eyes, I wasn't so sure I wanted to know the answer to that last question. There was something dark in those eyes, and now that I'd come back to my own senses, I suddenly became very worried for Blue Blood's safety. I fought back the urge to be sick right there, and tried desperately to push back the turmoil of my own thoughts as I pleaded with Crimson Storm. "Crimson Storm? I don't know what's going on," I said, looking from her to Blue Blood. "But can we please just leave? Everything hurts and I just want to go back to my room."
"I know it hurts, Twilight, and I'm sorry I was too late to stop him from doing that to you,"
Crimson replied, giving me an apologetic look before turning back to Blue Blood with an unpleasant grin.
"But if this little demon is anything like his father, and I'm fairly sure he is after what I've seen, he'll know some healing magic."
With one quick, brutal movement, she slammed the colt down onto the cold ground and pressed her weight down on him, pinning his legs and trapping him underneath her. Blue Blood gave a pained grunt as one of Crimson's hooves ground the side of his face into the floor.
"From the way your daddy tells it, the two of you learned quite a bit from your mother,"
Crimson continued.
"So go on, make some of that wonderful healing magic you were taught, and fix the poor filly."
Her last words were punctuated with a vicious sneer and another grind of her hoof into Blue Blood's face. Yeah, okay, please, just, stop," Blue Blood cried. "I'll do it." Blue Blood's horn lit up, and a bright blue aura washed over me. An instant later, I could feel the various aches and pains all over my body gradually begin to ebb. Despite the tumultuous mix of emotions I was feeling at the moment, I couldn't help but breathe a small sigh of relief as the dull throbbing pain in my back leg receded.
"There's a good cult,"
Crimson cooed, patting Blue Blood's cheek. Blue Blood let out a small whimper, but Crimson ignored him as she spoke, her tone eerily casual.
"You know, I've been watching you for a while now, Blue Blood. Ever since you arrived at the castle, in fact."
The pain was almost completely gone now, and I finally managed to rise to my hooves. I shook my back leg slightly to rid myself of some of the numbness that had set in before looking back to Crimson Storm. It was like I was looking at a completely different mare than the one Celestia introduced me to, and I wasn't sure how to feel about it. But then again, I wasn't really sure about anything at this point.
"Crimson Storm?"
I tried.
"It's all right. I'm okay now, see?"
I wiggled my back leg around to show it didn't hurt anymore.
"We can just go tell the princess what happened and let her deal with it. Please, let's just get out of here, okay?"
The mare eyed me silently, not a trace of emotion to be found in her stare. It was different from when I'd talked with her before. The look she gave me was so cold and empty that for a second, I feared she'd set her sights on me next.
"It might be best if you leave without me, Twilight,"
she replied with an eerie calm.
"I have work to do, and when it's done, you'll most likely never see me again. You can tell the princess what happened here if you want, but you'll have to find your own way back."
"What are you talking about?" I asked, dreading the answer. "Crimson Storm? What are you gonna do? Why can't we just go together?"
I have work to do,
she repeated, her lips curling into a joyous, vacant smile.
There's a debt that needs to be paid, and if the captain isn't going to pay it, then I'll take what I owed from his own son instead. Consequences be damned.
She slowly shook her head and lowered her gaze to the cult below her. Her smile widened a fraction of an inch.
I don't plan on leaving this place, Twilight, so you might as well go on without me.
I found I couldn't respond, nor did I move an inch from where I was. I stood transfixed by the sight of her looming over Blue Blood like a timber wolf ready to tear out the throat of its next meal. There was madness in her golden eyes. There was a sick sort of joy and eagerness there that most ponies probably would have found horrifying in these circumstances. I found it horrifying to an extent, but for me, it was also like looking in a mirror somehow. The image of that giggling lavender filly covered in blood came back to me, suddenly vivid in my mind. I shivered at the thought. With what? I didn't know, but it might not have entirely been disgust or fear.
Oh, Bluey, you tried to act like a gentle colt.
Crimson suddenly began in a pitying sort of tone.
Try to tell yourself that you're not like him. But I know better. What you did to this filly here only proves that deep down, no matter how much you want to deny it, no matter how you try to hide behind fancy words and manipulation, you're just as much of a brute as he is. Well, you know what, Blue Blood?
She leaned in close to Blue Blood and smiled that same terrible smile that we'd both worn earlier. Crimson Storm's next words brought my thoughts screeching to a halt. They came out in a low hiss that made the skin beneath my fur crawl.
I can be a brute too.
I watched Crimson Storm lift her hoof from Blue Blood's face and raise it into the air. It seemed to hang above his head for an age, and it was with a sickening mix of dread and anticipation that I realized what would happen next. I saw the look on her face, the unsettling wide smile, the mad glint in her eyes, the mounting horror in Blue Blood as he turned to see that hoof above him. I saw the hoof come down, and distantly felt a surge of mana rush into my horn at the same moment. I thought I could hear a faint desperate cry somewhere, but I couldn't figure out whose it was. My mind was far too preoccupied with the sight of Crimson Storm smashing Blue Blood's face into a pulpy mess to pay those other things any heed. I couldn't do anything but stand there, my mouth dry and my face frozen in shock as the red hoof turned an even darker shade of red. The fur around it grew wet and glistened oddly bright in the light of the wall-mounted torches. My ears twitched at every cry from Blue Blood, every dull thud as Crimson's hoof impacted his skull, the sickening quelch that soon followed, each labored breath and vicious grunt the crazed mare made. Flecks of blood splattered Crimson Storm's face, and I even felt a few drops hit me, but I barely noticed. I could feel my heart beating in time with each blow Blue Blood took, and as the gruesome display dragged on, agonized cries became pained grunts, which turned to muffled gurgles and eventually a series of quiet sighs. Then there was silence. Silence, save for Crimson Storm's quiet, uneven chuckle and the quelch of her hoof pounding into a mess of bone, flesh, and brain matter. As horrible as it was, I couldn't tear my eyes away from the sight. I didn't want to tear my eyes away from the sight. I wanted to see what happened next. I wanted to know what Crimson Storm would do next. Would she mutilate the body in her madness? Would she decide she hadn't had enough and come after me? Would she ask me to join her? What would I say? Yes. I could hear it now. I could see it, feel it, taste it, smell it all around me. The world, my world, was changing, expanding to include concepts previously unknown to me, or rather, hidden from me. It was here in this ancient dungeon that I finally bore witness to what my subconsciousness had been hiding from me. These thoughts, feelings, and emotions were at the root of all my problems, and I didn't even know it. The truth of who I was excited me as much as it terrified me. But back then, as a filly who couldn't properly sort out her own thoughts on what was happening, I simply let that truth and the hurricane of emotions that came with it wash over me in a tidal wave of fear, confusion, and bewilderment. Lieutenant Storm! And just like that, my life-changing revelation was shattered, and reality immediately reasserted itself. I blinked, and my confusion only mounted at the sight before me. Blue blood was still there, as was Crimson Storm, but there was no blood, no mangled flesh, no caved-in skull. None of what I had seen. There was only a terrified colt trapped beneath a psychotic royal guard bent on ending his life with her own hooves. To my shock, one of those hooves was held in a magenta-colored aura mere inches away from said colt's face. It was only then that I realized I was using magic to hold back Crimson Storm's hoof. I became very much aware of the strain of the act and very nearly lost my magical grip. Panic was the only thing that kept me holding on at that point. A second later, I registered the fact that some pony had called out Crimson Storm's name. Finally taking in the situation as a whole, I noticed neither Blue Blood nor Crimson Storm were looking at me. Both of their eyes were fixed on something at the top of the stairs. I turned to see what had distracted the two and gasped, all the fear and tension suddenly draining out of me. Standing silhouetted just past the doorway, her wings flared and her eyes blazing, was Princess Celestia herself. It was somewhat difficult to make her out from where I stood, but there was no mistaking that height and mane. "Princess," I breathed, letting the aura around my horn fade. When did you... Princess!" Blue Blood shouted, fruitlessly trying to wriggle his way from under Crimson Storm. Tears streamed from his wide, hopeful eyes, and snot ran down his face as he whined and pleaded. "Please, help me! Get me away from this mad mare! Please!" Crimson Storm, for her part, simply stared back up at the princess, one hoof in the air, and her face a stone slab devoid of any emotion. For a long, tense moment, no pony spoke, and after a second, the red mare slowly straightened up and stepped away from Blue Blood. Not wasting even a second, the panicked colt clumsily scrambled to his hooves and scurried up the stairs, whimpering and moaning the whole way. Celestia tried to say something, probably some words of comfort or reassurance, but Blue Blood galloped right past her without a word or a second glance. In a moment, he was gone, his frantic hoofsteps echoing loudly down the old corridor. Looking past Celestia, I could just make out the outline of Greedy Gut poking his head into the doorway from further back. I still couldn't see his expression, and before I could make sense of what he was doing there, he turned and hurried down the hall after Blue Blood. Celestia watched them go for a second before returning her attention to me and Crimson Storm. Her horn flashed bright gold, and in an instant, I was at the top of the stairs right next to the princess. As I tried to shake myself free of the sudden disorientation of being teleported, Princess Celestia spoke again, her hard gaze fixed on the mare still at the bottom of the stone steps. "You have much to explain, Crimson Storm," the princess exclaimed, her voice as cold and grim as the grave. "I don't know what transpired here, but it's clear from what I've seen with my own eyes that you meant to harm that colt, and quite severely from the looks of it." "Princess," I croaked through my dry throat. I swallowed and tried again. "Princess, wait. Crimson Storm, she..." "With all due respect, Your Majesty," came Crimson's flat reply from below. "I meant to do much more than that." The room grew very quiet as Celestia and I stared at Crimson Storm in open-mouthed shock. She stared back up at both of us, her posture rigid and her face an emotionless mask. I had no idea how I was going to manage it, but I'd fully meant to try and defend her actions in some way or another. All thoughts of trying to explain her situation to Celestia fled from my mind the moment I looked into her eyes. There was nothing in those golden yellow eyes. Even I could see that she'd completely given up, and in a way, I understood. That strange connection I'd felt when I first met her was somehow stronger now than it had been before. She'd lost her chance for revenge, and when Blue Blood's father found out what she'd nearly done, there'd be Tartarish to pay on top of whatever punishment the princess had planned for her. She was doomed either way, and I was beginning to think she'd known that all along. That no matter what happened, whether she succeeded in what she was trying to do or not, there was no going back for her. I looked up at Celestia and could see, even through her snow-white fur, that her face had gone deathly pale. I'd never seen her look so horrified, and the sight was enough to trigger my own fear. You... The princess began in a shaky whisper. Surely you didn't intend to.
My intention was to kill the captain's son, Your Majesty.
Crimson Storm smoothly interjected. Her gaze flicked towards me, and I felt my heart leap into my throat.
I might have succeeded if it weren't for the efforts of your protege.
She smiled a small, almost imperceptible smile.
You should be proud of her.
She smiled hollowly, but I could only gape at her in bewilderment and disbelief. Time seemed to freeze for the two of us as we stared at each other, but the moment quickly passed and I nearly jumped as Celestia addressed me. Twilight, is this true? Celestia asked. Her tone clipped, and her eyes still locked on Crimson Storm. Did she try to kill Blue Blood? Like Crimson Storm, Celestia's face had become completely unreadable. Seeing the princess like this somehow unnerved me more than Crimson's gaze. I might not have been able to see beyond her stony expression, but standing this close to her, I could see that she was shaking with some kind of emotion.
Yes,
I admitted after a moment.
But Blue Blood...
I see, the princess interrupted. She looked down at me, her mask broken, and a half-grateful, half-apologetic smile drawn on her face. This must have been a horrible experience for you, Twilight, and I'm sorry that I wasn't there to protect you from it. Rest assured, I won't let such a thing happen ever again. I eeped in surprise as I was pulled into a warm, tight hug by the princess. I may not have been expecting it, but in that moment, it was the only thing I wanted above all else. Even through her warm embrace, I could still feel Princess Celestia shaking, and looking up, I could see the tears that had begun streaming down her face. I'm so sorry, Twilight, she repeated in a soft, choked whisper. I'm so sorry I didn't get here sooner. Each and every apology stabbed at me like a knife, and it wasn't long before I started crying into her chest. I cried because of how heartbroken and scared she sounded. I cried for Crimson Storm and what she'd have to suffer through. I cried for what she might have to endure in the near future. I cried because I was scared and confused and didn't know what was happening to me. All the while, Crimson Storm didn't make a sound, nor did she move even an inch. She simply sat there like a statue, watching us without guilt, or remorse, or sadness, or anything. Eventually, my crying died down to the occasional sniff or hiccup, and Celestia released me. I wiped my tears away and looked back down at Crimson Storm. What's gonna happen to her? I asked, knowing it was nothing good. What are you gonna do, Princess? Don't you worry about that, Celestia replied warmly. I'll take care of everything from here, so you don't need to be afraid anymore. Her horn began to glow. I'm sending you back to your room so you can get some rest. I'm sure you'd like nothing more than to be as far away from here as possible. She wasn't wrong, but still. Princess, before you send me back, there's something you should know about. Now, Twilight, she cut in. There will be plenty of time for explanations tomorrow morning after you've gotten some sleep. I'll be up to check on you once I'm done here, alright? But, Twilight... I winced and grimaced at the admonishing tone in Celestia's voice. There was nothing I could do about it now, and it was with dismay and a feeling of defeat that I turned to Crimson Storm one last time. To my surprise, she smiled back up at me, and it wasn't an empty, hopeless smile. It was a smile full of sadness, but more than that, it was genuine. All right, Princess, I muttered, reluctantly turning away from the red mare. I'm ready. Celestia nodded, and with a golden flash, I was back in my own chambers beside the bed. I'd had some time to prepare, so the disorientation wasn't nearly as strong this time around. I was finally alone with my own thoughts, and that was far from a good thing, given the vast amount of morbid subject matter I had to think about. In one night, my entire world had flipped upside down, and I had no idea how I was going to sort all of this out. I crawled into the bed and pulled the covers over me. I rested my head back on the pillows. I closed my eyes, and I thought. My mind galloped a mile a minute as I tried to make sense of what I'd seen and what I thought I'd seen. I played the image of Blue Blood's brutal murder over and over in my mind, unable to completely move past it. I analyzed every facet of it, marveling at just how vivid the scene had been. I still had trouble differentiating it from what actually happened. I wasn't sure how long I laid there thinking about it, but it never got any less fascinating. If anything, it seemed to bring me some odd measure of peace the more I reminisced about it, like counting sheep. Added to that the fact of what Blue Blood had done to me, what his father had done to Crimson Storm, whatever punishment was in store for the mayor, and the memory of Blue Blood's gruesome death brought to the surface a sort of vindictive satisfaction. As much as I had to mull over, and as worried as I was about Crimson Storm, Celestia had been right. I was long overdue for some sleep after what I'd been through. My consciousness began to fade, and a few minutes later, I was gone, lost to the dreams I could never remember. Only this time, I did remember, and I continued to remember every single gruesome dream since that horrible night. Interlude. Sunde de Mata. First movement. My name is Octavia Melody, and like Twilight, I too have a story I wish to tell. I have my own sins to bear, and while the acts I've committed are no less horrifying and unforgivable than those of the one I called my closest friend, those acts and my own twisted disposition come from a much more personal place. I suppose you could say the darker aspects of my psyche were something I was destined to inherit from the beginning. If you are unsure as to what I mean, then allow me to tell you a bit of my family and where they come from. The first thing you must understand is that every member of my family, from immediate to extended, is a unicorn. The second is that the vast majority of those family members have been or are currently musicians of some repute. As such, the Melody family has become tremendously wealthy over the course of many generations. I am the first Earthpony to be born into the family, and that is where the root of the problem lie. My hometown of Trottingham was a large but rather isolated town in the middle of the Griffish Isles east of Equestria, and much of the populace consisted of unicorn traditionalists. For centuries, the vast majority of the citizens of Trottingham held to the old-fashioned belief that unicorns were the superior tribe. They believed themselves above Earthponies and Pegasi, a belief that originated from the old capital of Unicornia long ago. Earthpony and Pegasi travelers from the equestrian mainland rarely visited for this reason, but the opposite was true for those originally from Trottingham. To many Trottingham natives, Canterlot was a city of opportunity, and there were a great number that chose to move to Equestria to seek their fortune in the modern capital city. Supremacist notions aside, Trottingham was by no means a backwoods town economically. In an effort to modernize the town, there was some trade with both Equestria and the Griffonian kingdom, but generally, Trottingham was fairly self-sustaining and had been that way for ages. I won't go into detail because I myself do not know them, but through some clever decision making on the part of a previous mayor and the approval of the council at the time, Trottingham had become an economically wealthy town, almost on par with places like Manhattan or Philadelphia, though still on a much smaller scale, due to the fact that it was a smaller town compared to the larger cities in Equestria. Having said this, it's important for you to understand that while Trottingham was culturally and economically rich, many of its citizens were wealthy-thinking unicorn supremacists. In this modern day and age, there were occasionally some ponies that had traveled to Equestria and come back denouncing the old-fashioned ways and views of the town, but not nearly enough to make much of a difference. More often than not, those ponies were shunned or treated with no more respect than an earth pony would receive. In the end, those ponies would move back to Equestria, and the status quo would continue. Back during my great-grandmother's generation, my family had been among the Trottingham natives to move to the equestrian capital of Canterlot. The Melody family had already been well known in Equestria for producing some of the finest classical musicians in the world, and it wasn't long after they'd arrived before they made a name for themselves among the Canterlot nobility. On the surface, the Melody family had learned to tolerate the other pony tribes, more so out of necessity than anything, but in reality, they very much held firm in their supremacist beliefs and still do to this day. Now you can see how being born an earth pony in that kind of environment would be problematic. I suppose I should be grateful that I wasn't born in Trottingham, but they hardly mattered given who I was born to. I won't try to justify what Twilight and I have done, but I want you to know that, like Twilight, I am not well mentally. This, however, originates not from some possibly mysterious magical element, but rather from the sadistic mare that raised me as a tool instead of a daughter. Thus we come to my mother, Septima Melody. Whereas the rest of the Melody family had nothing but disdain for any pony who wasn't a unicorn or the princess herself, Septima Melody looked down on every pony. It didn't matter if they were earth ponies, pegasi, or other unicorns. To her, they were all worthless than the dirt beneath her hooves, and she wasn't shy about showing it. The only pony who showed even a modicum of respect for her was my father, and even then the love and tolerance between the two was as fragile as glass and just as transparent. My father was another unicorn whose family had moved from Trottingham to Canterlot, and the stallion carried the same prejudice and supremacist views of any other unicorn from that isolated town in the Griffish Isles. My mother had gone back to Trottingham for a time when she was younger, and that was when she met my father, Capriccio. They both travelled back to Canterlot together and married after a few years, taking the Melody family name in the process. Other than that, Capriccio Melody is hardly worth mentioning. Though I'd always wondered how he could fall for a mare like Septima Melody. Maybe it really was different back when they had first met. Maybe they really had loved each other deeply then, but by the time I was born, the love had become as brittle as dried leaves. Still, my father despised me as much as the rest of my family. He chose to ignore me altogether, unlike my mother. Septima was the real problem. This mare was the one who made me what I had eventually become. But I tell this tale to give what I feel is some much-needed insight, rather than to simply place blame. Septima Melody was an exceptional musician. Perhaps the most talented mare the Melody family had produced in several generations. With only a bit of practice, she could play just about any instrument with flawless precision, and a great number of the songs she composed were received by the masses as nothing short of brilliant. Naturally, all that prodigious talent, combined with great wealth and the influence of the nobility, made for a mare with bottomless pride and arrogance. Somehow, despite her horrendously haughty and sometimes downright cruel and vindictive disposition, the nobles still fawned over her. They fell over themselves to get in her good graces, did what they could to earn the closest seats during her concerts, and all the while, she devoured the attention like a ravenous timber wolf. For my mother, Life in Canterlot was a paradise, but she wasn't without her enemies. There were other musicians, some other nobles, but mostly commoners who desperately struggled their way to fame, only to have their dreams crushed under hoof by Septima melody. Sometimes they were in the way of some selfish ambition, sometimes it was because of some perceived slight against her, and sometimes it was because my mother simply didn't like the pony or found it amusing. Whatever her reasons, Septima had eventually become a monster in the eyes of many. She had become some pony that needed to be brought down, some pony that needed to be taught a lesson in humility. My mother didn't see the consequences of her actions, didn't see the hole she'd dug for herself. She couldn't, completely wrapped up in her own world as she was. Like the villain in a play who thought themselves untouchable, she was consumed by her own hubris. And just like that villain, that was her downfall. The end of her reign as one of the greatest musicians alive today. In Canterlot, most ponies generally tend to trot everywhere on their own, unlike places like Baltimore or Manhattan, where coaches were the most common way to travel around the city. In the wealthier districts of Canterlot, however, it was a far more common practice to hire a personal coach, especially if said pony was traveling through the poor or middle-class districts. My family was no different in this regard, and my mother often took a personal coach whenever she traveled to and from a concert. It was on the way back from one of those concerts late one night that her life took a turn for the worst. She'd been playing with the rest of the Canterlot Philharmonic Orchestra at the Great Celestial Theatre, which was located near the south of what would be considered Canterlot's middle-class district. Naturally, Septima's performance was perfect, and the show was a roaring success. After the show, my mother shook off her fans and separated herself from the rest of the crowd as she made her way back to her own personal carriage. Drunk off all the praise and adoration she received, the mare didn't realize the pony pulling her coach wasn't the one who'd taken her to the theater. Now, all of this was told to me by my mother herself, and this part in particular was told during one of her episodes, so the details here get a bit murky in my memory. From what I can remember, the coach pony had somehow managed to make its way to an abandoned street in one of the seedier neighborhoods of the poorer district without my mother's notice. Once she realized something was wrong, it was too late. She found herself ambushed by a group of thugs and was dragged off to some dark alley to be beaten mercilessly. Among the many injuries she presumably sustained, the worst by far was to her horn. The thugs had snapped her horn clean off and left her to stew in her own tears, bile, and agony. The way Mother tells it, I can only imagine how nightmarish an affair it must have been. Looking back on it, I would have laughed if it weren't for the suspicions that I had about my own conception. Mother had always been strangely light-lipped when it came to that subject. Oh, she and my father would talk for ages about how I should have never been born, and how I was a blight on the otherwise perfect Melody family, but neither ever spoke of how or why I was different from the rest. In any case, the only other thing I remember about what my mother told me was that she'd been left screaming for help for at least a few hours before the city watch found her broken and weeping in that alleyway. It was a horrendous scandal that made its way into every paper in Canterlot, and even a few in some of the larger cities in Equestria. I eventually found out that a few members of my family had paid quite a hefty sum of bits to certain important ponies to have the grittier details of the assault left unpublished. I never found out everything about what happened, but I'm certain it was for the benefit of the family as a whole. As for what became of Septima, her horn grew back eventually, as all unicorn horns do, but until it healed, she was out of commission for several days and her musical skills suffered for it. Even after it healed, her flawless precision and razor-sharp focus were never the same. She also suffered mentally from the event and refused to talk to any pony for several weeks after the incident. She spoke again after a period of time, but it was clear that she had changed, and not for the better. She began to have horribly violent episodes. She would occasionally mumble nonsensical things to herself when she thought she was alone. Over time, the sudden rages and incoherent babbling lessened, but never completely disappeared even after I was born. For the most part, she seemed to revert back to her normal self, at least in the eye of the public. A few things changed, however, aside from the rages and babbling. She resumed writing compositions, and while they were as beautifully written as they'd always been, she could no longer bring out the best in the music she played, and those who heard her play took notice. Her popularity began to wane, but she still had just enough skill to remain a prominent figure in the society of classical musicians. Despite her reduced presence, however, she'd become somewhat calmer overall, more sedate, more measured in her attitude towards others. If one paid close enough attention, one could still see the utter loathing and disgust she harbored for her fellow ponies, but she had become adept at hiding her vitriolic hate. This was all before I was born, of course, and it was only a few years later, after I'd been conceived, that I learned the truth. It was only after my mother had gifted me my first cello that I saw the twisted creature Septima melody had truly become behind closed doors. The living nightmare my life would become began with my mother, her lessons, and that wonderful, damnable cello. Chapter 10. The Retrospective. Act 2. Dissonance. What happened down in those dungeons changed me in a way I could have never expected. Maybe change isn't the right word for what happened. As much as I tried to deny it back then, it might have been more accurate to say that I had become whole. It was like a part of me had been locked away behind my subconscious mind, and the events that transpired in those dungeons released that lock and merged the conscious and subconscious together. No. Back then, it was more like they were haphazardly and clumsily welded together. I began to see things no pony else saw in more ways than one. Over the years, during the course of my stay in Canterlot Castle and my time as Princess Celestia's star pupil, I started to think differently. For the longest time, I was scared, horrified of what was happening to me. But over time, the curiosity began to outweigh the fear. It was a slippery slope at that point, but whenever I got curious, I would lose focus on everything else. Curiosity went hoof in hoof with interest and intrigue, and eventually, gradually, my mindset began to change. It was a wonder I managed to stay sane for all those years. Or that's what I would have thought if I believed for even a second that I was ever sane to begin with. I wondered how I was able to keep up the appearance of being a normal filly, a normal pony, for so long when my mind had become so twisted. To this day, I'm not quite sure, but I do know that it wasn't always easy. I'd almost aroused suspicion and nearly revealed just how crazy I was on more than one occasion. But in the end, I always got lucky somehow. Something would always come to my rescue, whether it was my own wit, some outside element, or the simple ignorance of whoever I'd encountered. Then one day, something happened. For the longest time, I'd danced with the idea that I might have been insane. But in the past, I always tried to find excuses, tried to justify my thoughts and actions to myself. It wasn't until this incident that I truly believed myself to be a mad mare. If I had to choose, I'd say there were 6 defining moments in my life, and all of them seemed to revolve around my sickness in one way or the other. The exam would have been the first defining moment of my life, as that was what I believe set this whole thing into motion. My experience in the dungeon was the second, as that was when the thin veil of my innocence had been lifted and tossed aside. That was when I truly began to see who I really was and what the darker recesses of my mind held. Most of my time in the castle after that had been learning to cope with dealing with the trials and tribulations of being Celestia's student. What probably exacerbated matters was the fact that I had to also deal with ponies I didn't like or even outright hated. Canterlot was a breeding ground for negative emotion where high society was concerned, and being as close to the princess as I was made it hard for me to avoid the nobility and their machinations, as I would soon learn. My encounter with Blueblood the 7th that night in the dungeons wouldn't be the last time I'd have to deal with him and his ilk. And the third defining moment in my life had much to do with him, his friends, and what happened with Crimson Storm. Crimson Storm. Ultimately, I never did find out what that mare was searching for, nor did I ever see her again. After the incident in the dungeons, I told the princess my side of the story and what Blueblood had revealed to me about Crimson Storm and the captain. I was shocked to find that Celestia had already known. The princess never told me the full details of what happened between her and Crimson Storm after I was teleported back to my room, but she did reveal that Greedy Gut of all ponies had returned and told her everything he knew about the situation just before she was about to send for the guards to take Crimson away. It turned out by pure luck, whether good or bad I couldn't say, the pudgy colt had stumbled upon the truth of what Blueblood's father had been doing to Crimson Storm. He'd kept his discovery a secret for fear of some kind of retaliation or punishment from Blueblood. Evidently, the whole thing sickened him, and he lost a lot of respect for Blueblood the 7th and his family after that, though he still didn't say or do anything about it until after all was said and done. Unlike Winter Chime, Greedy Gut wanted nothing to do with Blueblood's plan, but he was also painfully aware of just how powerful the House of Blueblood was and wouldn't risk his or his family's ruination at the hooves of Blueblood's father by disobeying the cult. The princess, of course, told no pony about Greedy Gut's involvement other than me, and I swore I wouldn't tell any pony. It might have been irresponsible of the princess when she'd agreed not to tell a soul, but as I've said, we were close, and up until this moment, years later, I'd kept that promise. Or rather, had completely forgotten about it over time. In any case, I asked Celestia about how she was able to find me, and found out that she'd noticed I was missing shortly after I'd left the gala. From there, all she could do was ask the castle staff which direction I'd been heading in, and had eventually deduced my location based on a hunch. As for how Crimson Storm found me, Celestia had no idea and couldn't get the mare to tell her. The only thing she was able to find out was that she was supposed to have been off duty that night and had apparently went out drinking somewhere at some point. She'd used some kind of excuse to return to the castle, and after that, I don't know. No pony knew. I began to wonder if maybe she'd been following me, but if that was the case, why hadn't she intervened right at the beginning? Why wait until the situation had gotten as bad as it did? Could it have been she was waiting for the right opportunity to catch Blueblood off guard? Thinking about it now, I wonder if her intention all along was to enter the castle so she could kill Blueblood. If that was the case, had she simply used me as a distraction? I want to believe that wasn't the case, but the more I think about it, the more it makes sense. Maybe Crimson Storm really had cared about me back then, but if she was out for some sort of revenge against the Blueblood family, then I may have been just a pawn despite any kind of bond we may have shared. When I asked Celestia how Crimson Storm had found me, she told me she didn't know. She told me Crimson Storm didn't say, but I wondered if the princess had known all along and was trying to protect me from the truth. Come to think of it, I never really found out anything about Crimson Storm at all. Really, why should I be surprised that she may have just been using me? I thought I connected with her, and in many ways I still think I do. But that didn't mean she didn't have her own goals, her own ideals, her own demons. She was hurting far more than I could have ever imagined, and I was just a filly who didn't understand. But now I do. And despite the very likely possibility that I was used, I still couldn't bring myself to dislike her. She was a victim. She didn't deserve any of what happened to her. I know that sounds hollow coming from a horrible pony like me, a pony that's caused so much suffering since then, but I truly do believe that. Celestia ordered the whole incident to be kept under wraps, so as not to incite any unrest amongst the citizens. And because of that, I never found out what happened to Crimson Storm. But if she still is alive out there somewhere, I hope she was able to find what she was looking for, even if she's no longer a royal guard. Of course, having gone through all of that, my issues were far from over. There was, after all, the matter of the noble house of Blue Blood, as well as my own dreams and how they affected me. Ever since that night, I began to remember the gruesome dreams and visions I had, and things only spiraled downward from there. She'd never outwardly said anything of the sort, but even as a filly, I'd gotten the impression that the princess thought I was scarred for life after what happened with Crimson Storm and Blue Blood. She was never fully convinced that I was okay after the exam, and I guess she thought that night must have pushed me over the edge. While something had definitely changed, me being scarred for life, at least in the way Celestia was imagining, was far from the case. Yes, I had questions. Lots of questions. And yes, I had horrible dreams. But those dreams were a different sort of problem I dared not talk to the princess about. Mostly, though, I was just confused and angry after the princess and I discussed the matter of what happened. She said I'd have a chance to talk to her about it from my point of view, but then a lot of rather convenient royal duties got in the way, and we didn't talk about it until almost a week later. At that point, I was frustrated, and the only thing keeping me from lashing out was the memory of the dream I'd had after Celestia had sent me back to my room. It was horrible. It was gruesome. It was vivid and visceral, but mostly, it made me think. I remembered each and every detail, and the feelings that stirred within me were hard to describe. For a good while, it occupied my mind and kept me distracted from the frustration of being kept in the dark by the princess. We did discuss that night in private eventually, but I was told very little about what actually happened after I was sent away, and nothing at all about what happened to Crimson Storm in the end. All I really gathered from the talk was that the issue of Crimson Storm's attempted murder had been dealt with in secret and that I didn't have to worry about her anymore. Had that been the end of it, I still would have been frustrated that I wasn't being told everything, sure, but I could have gotten over it over time. Then I asked about Blue Blood the 7th and his father, and that's what changed my frustration to outright fury. Celestia had been told about the way Captain Blueblood had treated Crimson Storm by Greedy Gut, but when she asked Crimson Storm directly about it, the mare had either denied any claims or simply said nothing. To her credit, the princess didn't stop there, and did question ponies who'd worked with Crimson Storm, but if any of them knew the truth, none of them said a word about it. She said something about a possible trial, but without any evidence, it wouldn't go anywhere. There was also the fact that Winterchime's mother was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, a fact which I hadn't forgotten, and as the Prince of Nobles, the captain mostly had her and most of, if not all, of the Associate Justices in his pocket. Normally I wouldn't have known anything about that as a filly, but my time hanging out with the captain's son before the gala had opened my eyes to a few of the darker dealings the nobility were involved in. I didn't understand all of it, but I had learned enough to know that not all was as it seemed when it came to who held the power. In short, there would be virtually no punishment for the captain's actions because nothing could be proven. There were only two things I could take solace in. One was the fact that whatever had happened to Crimson Storm, she was most likely far from the captain's reach. The other was that the actions of the captain's son were a little more difficult to hide. It was true that I had been healed before the princess arrived, but the sorrow state of my fancy white dress had been evidence enough for Celestia. She initially wanted to blame Crimson Storm for harming me, but I was very quick to point out otherwise. Again, I wasn't told exactly what Blue Blood's punishment would be, but the princess assured me it would be severe. At the time, that was enough for me, but that was mostly because of what I'd personally done to the cult in the aforementioned dream I'd had. Among the many feelings that dream invoked in me, one of them had certainly been a very grim satisfaction. In my mind, I'd already given the cult the punishment I felt he deserved deep down. I told Celestia nothing of what I truly felt, as there was a lot more fear, disgust, shame, and confusion than any sense of gratification. I'd planned to take the memory of that dream and all dreams following it to my grave, but that wasn't meant to be. At least, not for the first dream. I'd made the terrible mistake of telling some pony about the first dream I'd actually remembered, and it would be the last time I told any pony anything about the darker thoughts that lie inside. My story is far from over, and before it's done, I want to give you an idea of what my life was like from that point forward. I also want, no, I need to tell you of the events that led up to the point I truly accepted that I was a very sick pony. Before that, though, I think it might be best to bring attention to the only other pony who'd known anything about my secret, aside from Octavia. Chapter 11. The Therapist. It just so happened that my next therapy session had been scheduled not long after the gala. Now, it's not like I hated therapy or my assigned therapist, Soundmind. I just found the whole thing uncomfortable. The stallion was nice enough, but I didn't like the questions he asked. I didn't like how vulnerable they made me feel, and the piercing gaze he would give me occasionally didn't help. It felt like he was seeing right through me, like he was reading my mind. I'd only had a total of 2 therapy sessions so far since the exam, one a few days after I'd gotten out of the hospital, and another not long after I had moved into the castle. The first time had been more for an introduction than any actual session, and the second time had been Soundmind more or less getting to know me. I'd only met the stallion twice, but both times he'd given off this mysterious air that kept me at a distance. Up until the 3rd session, I hadn't really said much about myself or what I was thinking, but that was before the gala. Back then, I didn't have any kind of emotional baggage weighing me down, at least not that I knew about. Then that night happened, and it left me a confused mess. It left me vulnerable. It was only a day or 2 after I'd had my talk with the princess that Soundmind came to visit me at the castle. In lieu of an actual office, we used the private sitting room near Celestia's chamber this time around. It made me feel all the more nervous about speaking my mind, but both the princess and Soundmind assured me no pony other than the therapist would hear what I had to say. Soundmind mentioned something about a patient confidentiality clause that even Princess Celestia herself had to follow. It did little to quell the unease, but I nodded along nevertheless, and we proceeded to talk for the 3rd time. What follows is an account of that 3rd session, And in telling you this, perhaps you might understand why I found Soundmind so unsettling. The setting may have been different than the last 2 times I'd seen the psychotherapist, but the meeting played out more or less the same. I sat in one of the rather cushy white armchairs, and Soundmind took the seat opposite me. There was a clipboard along with a pencil, both of which he'd set off to the side. In both the meetings we'd had before, I had never once seen the stallion write anything down on or even look at the clipboard he kept with him. It's like he brought them as a formality as opposed to actually having a need for them. At the time, I thought it might have just been because he thought it might look awkward mouth-writing after everything I said. Hoof-writing was a skill most ponies tended to pass on due to the difficulty involved in mastering tactile magic. It was easier for earth ponies, but even then, many thought it simply wasn't worth the trouble. It was a skill mostly used by earth ponies whose jobs revolved around dealing with lots of paperwork. I just assumed Soundmind neglected to learn how to write with his hooves and didn't want to bother with his notes. Between the two of us was a coffee table with 2 mugs sitting atop it. At the princess's insistence, a maid had brought both of us something to drink. Soundmind had asked for some actual coffee, and I'd gotten some hot cocoa. It wasn't all that cold in the room, but it was getting closer to winter, and the weather was getting colder. I figured if I had to drink something, it was as good a time as any for the warm beverage. That, and it was one of my favorite drinks growing up. There was a moment of silence between us as Soundmind took some time to sip his coffee. I watched him somewhat warily, shifting uncomfortably in my seat from nervous anticipation. I couldn't help but wring my hooves at the thought of what kind of probing questions he would ask. The stallion didn't look intimidating in the slightest. He was a tall, thin earth pony with a tan coat and a short, neatly cut black mane and tail. Beneath the horn-rimmed spectacles were calm, intelligent, piercing amber eyes that almost seemed to glow in the rather dim light of the sitting room. That last part may have just been my imagination, but that didn't ease the nervous lump in my throat. Honestly, aside from his eyes, he didn't exactly cut that very imposing figure overall. But then again, it wasn't his overall appearance that made me shy away. "It's good to see you again, Twilight," he began, setting his mug down on the table before speaking again. "How's life been treating you since we last met?" The stallion had a pleasant voice, deep but not overly so. The way he spoke reminded me a bit of my dad, but rather than comfort me, it only made me that much more eerie. I winced slightly at the question and took a moment to answer, my gaze locked squarely on the table in front of me. "I got attacked during the gala," I muttered, slightly annoyed at the particular question. I flashed a quick frown in his direction before lowering my eyes once more. "Didn't the princess tell you about what happened?" "That she did," Soundmind replied with a sad shake of his head. "A terrible business, that. I'm glad you managed to make it through such a nasty experience." He leaned forward and gave me that look, that intense, searching gaze he used sometimes. "Yes, Twilight, I'm aware of how you might be feeling, but I'd like to hear it from you. Do you think you'll be okay? Mentally, I mean." I looked away and shrugged half-heartedly. "I'll probably be fine after a while," I replied quietly. "I'm a little angry about what happened, but—" "Angry?" he interjected with a raised brow. "Not scared? Aren't you horrified that you may have very well died down there in that dungeon? Most fools your age would be terrified to leave their room after what I'd heard you experienced." "I don't know," I murmur, shrinking in on myself. I mean, yeah, it was scary, but the princess came and everything worked out, right? Besides, it's not like Crimson Storm was trying to hurt me." I couldn't help a small scowl cross my lips. "It was Blue Blood who did that, and that stupid winter chime pushed me down the stairs.
And then Blue Blood, he wanted me to...
I snapped my mouth shut and froze, the memory of what Blue Blood had told me about his father running through my mind. That inevitably caused me to think about my own thoughts as I listened to him. And that made me remember what I wanted to do to Blue Blood. What I almost did. Twilight? I blinked and looked up to see Soundmind frowning at me in concern. He no longer had that strange searching look, but his eyes were still fixed on me. I grimaced and looked away, upset that I'd already said so much and almost revealed something that should have never come to light.
I'm fine, I huffed. Yeah, I was scared before, but the princess saved me and she told me Blue Blood got punished, so there's no reason to be scared anymore.
And what of the mare? Crimson Storm, I believe her name was. Soundmind asked, leaning back in his seat. She may not have intended to harm you, as you say, but that doesn't change the fact that she nearly killed a fool right in front of you. Surely that must have left you shaken. My mouth twitched at the word kill, but I held my silence for another moment and thought about my answer. I should have expected the stallion to be that direct. He'd been that way from the beginning, always cutting to the heart of the matter and asking the hard questions.
Well, it did, but...
I struggled with my words, but Soundmind merely continued to watch me patiently. Seeing his calm, expectant expression, something clicked in my mind, and I frowned, my tone growing suddenly cold.
I'm trying not to think about it.
Soundmind eyed me with an inscrutable expression for a long second before giving a small chuckle and reaching for his coffee mug. I see, the stallion replied after taking another sip of coffee. I'm sorry if I've made you feel uncomfortable with my questions, Twilight, but I'm worried for you, and I'd rather remiss in my role as a therapist if I didn't try to pry a little. I'd like you to open up a bit more, sure, but like I said in our last meeting, you don't have to tell me anything you're not ready for me to hear. I didn't have a response to that, so I remained silent and waited for him to speak again. He held his mug in one hoof and idly tapped the arm of the chair with the other, seemingly lost in thought as he watched me. It went on long enough that I was about to say something about it, but then he finally spoke again. This anger of yours, he began. Where does it come from? From what the princess tells me, you seem to have formed quite the bond with Crimson Storm, despite the fact that you two hadn't known each other all that long. Are you upset because the captain wasn't punished for his supposed crimes against Crimson Storm?
Well, yeah,
I snapped, rising up in my seat.
It's not fair. That evil pony hurt Crimson Storm so much for so long, and he's not gonna get any kind of punishment for it. No pony saying anything about what happened, not even Crimson Storm herself. The princess can't do anything because there's no evidence any pony can use against Blue Blood's dad, and...
My angry tirade ground to a halt as I stared at Soundmind. He looked as calm as ever, but that eerie look had returned, and as I trailed off, he took the opportunity to speak in my place. You're mad that justice hasn't been served then? He inquired softly. You're angry that Captain Blueblood is going to get away with the abuse of a poor mare who only lashed out at his son because she felt she had no other choice. An odd smile crossed his face, and something about it made me shiver slightly. She wanted revenge, and she felt killing the captain's son was the only way she was going to get it. He continued, taking another sip of coffee and leaning forward to place the mug back on the table. And you sympathize, don't you? My mouth opened, but no words came out. I slowly sunk back into my chair and tried to think of a response, but all I could manage were a few stuttering, half-formed words. Soundmind ignored them and pushed on. No, it's more than that, isn't it? He pressed, his strangely bright amber eyes staring deep into my own wide amethyst eyes. There's something that's not being said here. Something very intriguing. A much deeper issue that hides just beneath the surface. It felt like the air was growing colder by the second, and I found it hard to look away from the stallion's burning gaze. This by far had been the most unnerving therapy session I'd had with Soundmind, and I had to resist the urge to flee from the room, from the stallion's piercing amber eyes. Then, the therapist leaned back in his chair and sighed, and just like that, all the tension in the air vanished. His strange smile vanished along with it, and was replaced with a more kindly sort of grin. But I can see I've made you uncomfortable yet again. He continued in a more measured, friendly tone. I apologize, Twilight. I'm good at what I do. Very good. But I tend to get a bit carried away when I feel I've gotten close to a breakthrough. It's the reason I don't get as many clients as I'd like. He shrugged. I'm trying to work on that, but old habits die hard, you know. At my lack of a reply, Soundmind sighed again and picked up his clipboard from where he set it. To my surprise, he began writing down something on the parchment attached to the clipboard with a steady-looking hoof. Despite being shaken by Soundmind's earlier words, I couldn't help but wonder why he forgone the use of his notes if his hoof writing was so fluent. The next few moments passed in relative silence as Soundmind continued to write something down on his clipboard. It gave me a chance to calm down and think about my situation and the therapist's words. I wasn't sure how much he'd guessed, and wondered just how he'd even guessed how I truly felt at all. I couldn't wrap my head around it, and if I was being honest, it kind of scared me. This was why I didn't like talking to Soundmind. Every time I did, I couldn't stop myself from giving something away, and when I did, he always managed to drag out more information than he should have been able to. I was afraid if I'd said anything else, he'd find out exactly what I'd been desperately trying to hide. All right, Miss Sparkle, he finally said after placing the clipboard down in front of him. I did have a few more general questions and some other matters to discuss, but I think after everything that's happened to you recently, it would be prudent to end our session here for today. You're clearly still stressed about the situation, and in my opinion, it might be better to give you some time to clear your head. I gave an audible sigh of relief at that, letting out a breath I hadn't noticed I was holding. The therapist chuckled at my reaction to the news, but then frowned at me as I went to hop off my chair. Before we end things here, though, he began, causing me to stop, grimace slightly, and slowly ease back into the chair. There is one more thing I'd like to ask you. I know I've said you don't have to tell me anything you're not ready to tell me, but if you could give me an honest answer, I'd greatly appreciate it. Okay, I replied hesitantly. I wasn't sure I liked where this was going, and the fact that his intense expression had returned with a vengeance only made me worry more. I guess that's fine, if it's just one more question. My regret in saying that was immediate, but it had already been said, and besides that, there was something different about the way he looked at me. He looked needy, like he was desperate for an answer to the question he wanted to ask. It was weird, to be sure, but I found myself not wanting to turn him down outright. Thank you for your cooperation, Twilight, he replied gratefully, a small smile breaking out on his face. He relaxed a bit and cleared his throat before speaking again. Now then, my question for you is this. He paused, seemingly for effect, then looking me dead in the eye, he asked, given the opportunity, if it was up to you, and if there were no consequences for your actions, how would you punish the captain, Twilight Sparkle? What would you do? The question floored me. Once again, the stallion had cut straight to the heart of the matter, and that question alone had revealed he knew something about the true nature of my thoughts. Perhaps I was looking too deeply into it, but as I said before, my imagination tended to run away with me when I was a filly, and all I could think of at the time was, he knows. My eyes were wide and panicky, my heart was racing, and my breathing grew shallow as my imagination ran wild with horrible possibilities. What is he going to do? What if he tells the princess? What would she do? Would she drop me as a student? Would she do to me whatever she did to Crimson Storm? Those thoughts and more swirled around and around in my head, and my fear grew more and more. That was until Soundmind spoke again, his calm and pleasant voice breaking through the mire of distress that was building inside me. There's no need to panic, Twilight, he assured me with a kind smile and placating raise of his hoof. As I said, you don't have to tell me if you don't want to. He took up his mug and finished off the rest of his coffee before giving a soft, satisfied sigh. If you'll allow me to be completely candid for a moment, this is more for my own curiosity than anything else.
Your curiosity?
I asked, nonplussed at the nonchalant admittance. That's right. He nodded and put the mug back down. As I've said before, I don't get to work with very many clients, and even less in your unique position. This may be a bit unprofessional of me to say, but as a client, you fascinate me, Twilight Sparkle.
I do?
I asked, taken aback.
Why? How?
To be honest, I'm not quite sure myself. Not yet, anyway. He replied with a thoughtful hum. But I'd like to find out. Thus the question. He gave me an apologetic smile. Again, I'm sorry for causing so much undue stress, but always remember that, barring a few extreme circumstances, everything said between the two of us is absolutely confidential.
Yeah, but...
I bit my lip and stared down at my hooves.
I don't really know if...
With my head down, I couldn't see Soundmind's expression, but I could hear the concern in his next words. Twilight, I know there's something you're afraid to tell me. Afraid to tell any pony. He said after a second or two. I stiffened and snapped a fearful look in his direction, but the stallion only smiled back, his eyes full of warmth and understanding. But I want you to know that I'm here to help. I know that there are some things that can't and shouldn't be bottled up.
I know that,
I replied without much confidence.
I know what you mean. The princess already told me that, but...
But? Soundmind urged. I squirmed for a bit, both mentally and physically, unsure of what to do. I had initially planned not to tell the therapist anything, but somehow he'd already almost guessed at my true feelings, and he was right in a way. At this point, I wasn't sure how long I could keep up hiding such a dark secret, especially from some pony as perceptive as Soundmind. Maybe I would feel a bit better if I told Soundmind something about what was really going on. Not everything, but maybe if I told him about that dream, he might be able to shed some light on what was happening to me. That was what he was there for after all, and he did say he was legally required not to tell any pony what we talked about.
I've had strange dreams.
I began reluctantly.
Ever since I got out of the hospital after what happened back then.
The exam, Soundmind muttered, to which I nodded silently. He gave another thoughtful hum. Does the princess know about these dreams?
No pony does.
I replied with a shake of my head. Up until the night of the gala, I didn't even remember the dreams I had. I just know they were weird. They made me feel weird. I see, Soundmind replied. Can you describe that feeling in more detail? Not really, I answered, frowning as I tried to remember the sensation. I just remember feeling scared and something else. And you said you hadn't remembered any of these dreams until after what happened during the gala? The stallion surmised. I take that to mean this was the first time you've actually kept the memory of what happened in those dreams? I gave an affirmative nod, but didn't say anything, prompting Soundmind to continue. There is something I find rather strange, he said, tapping his chin. You call them dreams, but your behavior and unwillingness to talk about them would indicate them to be nightmares. You even said yourself that you felt scared when you woke up, even though you didn't remember anything. I don't know, I replied, my eyes still firmly locked on my hooves. They might be nightmares, but they don't really feel that way to me. It's just that the things that happen in the dreams, they're bad things. Really bad things. Soundmind was quiet for another long moment, long enough for me to look back up at him out of nervous curiosity. He wasn't looking at me, but rather seemed to be lost in thought about something. His eyes had wandered off towards some point in the distance, and his mouth was turned down in an odd frown. Mr. Soundmind? I asked worriedly. Are you okay? Did I say something wrong? He muttered, blinking and turning to look back at me. He cleared his throat and smiled sheepishly. Ah, sorry about that. No, you haven't said anything wrong, Twilight. Please, continue. He motioned for me to speak. Can you tell me a bit about the dream you remembered? Well, it was about Blue Blood. The captain's son, I mean. I began, swallowing nervously. I wanted to stop there before I said anything else, but I'd already started and figured it was now or never. In the dream, I did something horrible to him. A lot of horrible things, actually. Such as? Soundmind asked. I watched him silently for a moment, looking for something in his expression. I wasn't exactly sure what I was looking for, but whatever it was, I didn't find it, so I continued. We were back in the dungeons, but this time, I was the one standing over Blue Blood. As I told Soundmind what had transpired, my mind went back to the dream, its contents still horribly vivid in my mind. Even now, all these years later, I can still remember how our roles had been reversed. I was the one standing over Blue Blood in that dark, damp dungeon. My leg had only been sprained, but I'd made sure Blue Blood's was completely broken as I slammed into it with a thick iron bar I'd picked up from somewhere. It took a few hits, but eventually there was a loud, satisfying snap. And unfortunately for him, I didn't know any healing magic. Crimson Storm was nowhere to be seen, nor was Celestia, Greedy Gut, or Winter Chime. It was just the two of us, and I wouldn't have had it any other way. I remember just standing there for the longest time, simply loving Blue Blood's wordless cries of pain. At one point, he threatened to tell his father what I'd done, but that only made me laugh. Then I shut him up with a telekinetic swing of the bar. It connected to his jaw with an audible crunch, and I was happy to hear something break. It may have been a dream, but I swear I could feel the impact of the blow, and it sent shivers down my spine. A foolish giggle escaped my lips as I lowered myself down to his level so that we were face to face. You're not gonna tell Daddy about me, because I won't let you, I whispered, softly tapping the iron bar against the mangled side of his face. He whimpered again, and my grin widened. And even if he did come through that door right now, it wouldn't matter, because I'd just do the same thing to him that I'm gonna do to you. Those were the first and final words I spoke to the cult before madness and bloodlust took over. What followed next couldn't be described as anything other than me beating Blue Blood into a pulpy mess of fur, bone, and flesh. I stabbed at him with the sharp end of the bar, piercing the skin anywhere I thought wouldn't be fatal. I smashed at his ribs and spine until I heard them break, then hit him a few more times for good measure. Then a few times more, because it just felt that good. On and on and on it went for I don't know how long. His screams never let up, no matter how much I brutalized his poor twisted frame, and my laughter never stopped. Both the floor around us and my face, chest, and front legs were speckled and splattered with red so dark it was almost black in the dim light. I wasn't too familiar with how dreams affected the senses, but I know they shouldn't have been as strong as they were then. The smell of copper was thick in my nose, and its taste was overpowering. But all of that only enticed me to hit Blue Blood that much harder. Each heavy thud of the bar against Blue Blood's increasingly motionless body grew a little wetter until it became a horrible, beautiful squelch. It was a bittersweet sound, because it meant that my fun was just about over. I pouted for a moment as the cult's screams died down to gurgles and his eyes began to flicker closed. Then I got an idea. With a smile as wide as the ocean, I let the magenta aura around the bloody iron bar fade, and it fell to the floor with a loud clang. That done, I lit up my horn again and grabbed hold of Blue Blood's head, causing the cult to perk back up despite his broken, near-unconscious state. I couldn't help but laugh again at his horrified expression. It was comical in its intensity, and was made all the more so as I started to mentally squeeze his head in. I wasn't sure whether I was strong enough to cave in some pony's skull with just my magic alone, but it seemed I'd softened up his head enough to make it work. I was even able to wring one last gurgling scream out of him before the pressure grew too great. I was giddy with anticipation, my heart racing as I watched his face twist and contort into all kinds of funny shapes. I just continued squeezing and squeezing and squeezing until... I believe I've heard quite enough for now, Miss Sparkle. The calm tone of Soundmind's voice snapped me out of a reverie I hadn't even known I was in. I blinked a few times and looked around the room, feeling disoriented, groggy, and slightly giddy. Huh? What? My confused gaze eventually rested on the therapist's passive face. Mr. Soundmind, what happened? A very good question, that. He replied easily before leaning forward. Why don't you tell me, Twilight Sparkle? What do you think happened? Well, I began, scrunching my face up in thought. We were talking about my dream, and... I froze, my face gradually growing paler as realization washed over me. And I... I started to shake violently, tears filling my wide, horrified eyes as I tried to remember exactly what I'd told Soundmind. The words I used escaped me, but I knew without a doubt I'd told him everything about that dream, far more than I meant to, and probably in gruesome detail. Oh no, I muttered weakly. No. I didn't mean... Twilight, relax, Soundmind said in as soothing a voice as he could muster. I'm not here to judge you. I'm a monster, I continued as I started to hyperventilate. I'm just like the captain.
Worse than him. Those noble ponies were right. I shouldn't be here. I don't deserve to be the princess's student. I should be locked up or sent to Tartarus or
Twilight! I stared at the stallion's stern tone and looked up at him, shivering and sniffling all while. Once he had my attention, he eased back in his chair and gave me another warm, understanding smile. It wasn't as potent as one of Celestia's smiles, but it was still surprisingly effective. "There's no need to panic," he said softly. "Everything is going to be okay. Do you hear me?"
But it's not, I whined. Ponies don't have those kinds of dreams. They don't do the things I did. I'm not normal, and when the princess finds out,
She's not going to find out. That stopped me cold, and all I could do for the next few seconds was stare at the stallion in disbelief.
What?
"She's not going to find out," Soundmind repeated seriously. "Twilight, since you opened yourself up to me, I'm going to be honest with you." He looked at me from over his horn-rimmed glasses, his strangely intense gaze unfiltered by the spectacles he wore. "If I were any other therapist, I'd most likely have reported what you've told me to the princess and let her sort out the issue." My heart leapt into my throat at Soundmind's words, but before I could say anything, he raised a hoof. "Let me finish, please," he continued quickly. He waited until I had closed my mouth before speaking again. "Thank you. Now, as I was saying, if you've told me about this dream with any sort of horror or regret or guilt, we wouldn't have had a problem. But that wasn't the case here."
What do you mean?
I asked, almost afraid to hear the answer.
What happened? What did I do?
"That right there is one of the problems," he replied, pointing at me. "The fact you don't even remember what you said to me might suggest something serious." He lowered his hoof and shook his head slowly. "For your sake, I won't repeat back what you said to me or how you said it. But I do want you to know that it wouldn't be a good idea to tell any pony else about your dreams."
Wait,
I replied, my fear and panic slowly giving way to hope.
So, you're telling me to keep a secret? You want me to keep a secret?
"I do." He nodded. "As though any good therapist worth their salt were to do otherwise, I'm also going to keep our conversation a secret."
But why?
I hiccuped. I didn't want to push my luck, but I had to know. It didn't make any sense to me then.
I'm a bad pony. I wanted to...
It's because I don't think you're a bad pony, Soundmind replied kindly. "I just think you may be confused and scared by both recent events and what happened during the exam. There may be some residual trauma left over from the exam, and your mind may be trying to cope with it in strange and unexpected ways. But I truly believe you can overcome something like this on your own." He stood from his chair, trotted around the table to where I sat, and put a hoof on my shoulder. He removed his glasses and looked down at me with such sternness and confidence that I couldn't help but believe every word he said to me. "I'll say it again. You, Twilight Sparkle, are not a bad pony," he exclaimed with absolute conviction in his voice. "You may have bad thoughts every once in a while. You may hear voices in your head that tell you to do bad things. But all you have to do is ignore them, and you'll be fine. Do you understand?"
I just have to ignore them?
I repeated timidly, to which he nodded empathetically. I blinked and looked at my own hooves, feeling a strange but welcome sense of relief flood through me.
I just have to ignore them. I can do that.
Good girl. Soundmind chuckled, patting my shoulder before stepping away and back towards his own chair. Just remember what I told you, and everything will work out." He gathered up his pencil and clipboard as he sat back down, then looked at the old grandfather clock sitting at one end of the room. "Ah, it looks like we finished just in time for the princess's first recess." He turned back to me. "I still have something I need to take care of, so why don't you go on ahead and let her know we're done here?"
Oh, okay then," I replied, hopping down from my seat and quickly heading towards the sitting room entrance. I was more than happy to leave the stallion to his own devices, but as I neared the large oaken door, I stopped and turned to give the therapist one last grateful smile. "Goodbye, Mr. Soundmind, and thanks for, I promise I won't tell any pony else."
"Think nothing of it, Twilight," he replied with a small smile and a wave of dismissal. "You have a good day now, and I'll see you again next month. Oh, and let's not speak any more about what transpired here from now on, eh?"
Right. Okay," I replied, suddenly wary of the stallion for some reason. "I'll be going now." He didn't reply this time, already staring back down at his notes. I watched him for another moment longer, wondering what felt so wrong. He seemed to be off in his own little world, scratching away at the parchment attached to his clipboard. Then he chuckled to himself suddenly, and a wide smile grin split his face. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a cold chill run down my spine at the sight. Deciding it was time to leave, I quickly turned the handle, pulled the door open, and let myself out of the room, wanting to put as much distance as I could between myself and Soundmind. To this day, I wasn't quite sure what that was all about, and I never had the nerve to ask. But our meetings from that point onward were normal. Well, as normal as one could get with Soundmind's eccentricities. The stallion kept his word and didn't tell the princess or any pony else about that session, as far as I knew anyway. Just as he suggested, we never spoke about my condition again, and I never told another soul about my dreams. At least, not until the last time I met Octavia Melody.